30,000 years ago, an ancient cave dweller painted a picture of a horse on the wall of his cave. It was probably a depiction of the family's target for hunting. Capturing the spirit of the beast in art would likely have been associated with capturing the beast itself. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of domesticated horses as far back as 3500 BC by the Botai culture in ancient Kazakhstan. By 700 BC, the challenge that my horse is faster than your horse was a firmly established aspect of social life throughout the known world. That is, not in the Americas, because, sorry, no horse for you. This week's video is not going to be a comprehensive history of horse racing games. There are just too many of them. We'd be here all day. There is a geek list on BoardGameGeek.com that lists over 200 horse race games. So what I'm going to give you is a kind of a historical overview of just a few of them. Obviously, board games with racing themes go back centuries before the printing press. Rolling dice and moving rocks around a tabletop track is probably the earliest form of the race game in general. The Korean game of Nyote is specifically about horse racing, and certain games in the tables family were probably imagined as horse races or chariot races, but I'm going to focus on the commercially published games over the past couple of centuries. And the earliest example I could find was this German paperboard, printed by D.K. Müller and Company, a board game called The English Horse Race that was printed in 1835. It was an adaptation of the old game of Goose, simply a roll and move game with some hazards on the spaces, but it was reconfigured into a track with a start and finish. The game of Goose has been said to be the oldest commercially published game in the Western Hemisphere, and it was adapted to all kinds of themes, from tourism to railroads to religious indoctrination, and, of course, horse racing. Now, there's a form of horse racing that goes back to the 1700s that's known as a steeplechase. Originally, it was literally a race from one church steeple to another. The very first account of such a race was recorded in 1752 and is a document that resides in the Drumland Castle Museum in Ireland. Now, in later years, these races were staged between different sets of steeples, and they had their own obstacles to overcome. And as the competition became more popular, they decided to standardize these obstacles and the course of the track, the distance of the track, and so on. A steeplechase board game was actually patented in 1851 in France by a toy maker named Georges Tompier. Within just a few decades, there were many variations of the steeplechase game available. The whole game industry was coming of age, and the modern configuration of board games that we know today, with boards and bits and boxes, began to be established about that time period. And one of the very oldest games in my collection is this one. This is a little wooden box, the game of the race, with the pieces inside. And here's the board, which is not original. I created this from artwork that was provided to me by R.C. Bell in his famous Big Book of Games. And then this is the original dice cup that came with the game. Little teeny weeny ivory dice. I do not have a decent set of the pewter horses that originally came with the board, so I have these little plastic guys for the time being. Someday I'll get some of those pewter horses too. But this is what the game of the race looked like. The board was actually bigger than this in the original configuration. And now another very, very old artifact that I have in my collection is this little wooden apple. This little wooden apple has inside of it a spinner and some little horse racing tokens. I don't have the BB, but it would have a BB in there, and you spin it, and the BB would land on one of these colors in there, like a roulette type of wheel. And then that's who would be able to move their little marker around the track. I assume there was a track that went with it at some point. Now, I've tried to date this, and inside the cover here, there's a patent number, I looked up that patent number, and if it's a U.S. patent, it actually dates back to the 1860s. But most of the places that I find records of these say that it's an early 20th century device. But it's still old nonetheless, and worth a pretty penny as well. This version, called Jerome Park, was published by the McLaughlin brothers in 1885. The actual racetrack, Jerome Park, was located in Fordham section of the Bronx and staged races from the late 1860s to around 1890. McLaughlin brothers published many variations of steeplechase games. This one's from 1904, until their company was bought in 1920 by Milton Bradley. Milton Bradley already had their own steeplechase game in production, and that was published well into the 1930s. The steeplechase game can still be found in a lot of books, of course, and in some reproductions that you can buy online and in gift shops. Now, around 1908, the Parker Games Company Limited of London came out with a card game called Derby Day. This Parker Games Company in London was the London office of the Parker Brothers Company from Salem, Massachusetts, that we're all familiar with. The Derby Day game was manufactured by the Charles Goodall and Sons Company. They had been the premier printer of cardstock in the UK for essentially the entire century. But then here's a version that was published by the Anglo-American Card Company in Canada. And another version was printed by the Good Luck Playing Cards Company in Amsterdam, Netherlands. But then in 1930, the Parker Brothers Company completely redefined the game called Derby Day. They published this one throughout the 1930s and included a very large racetrack board. Here it is spread out on somebody's couch. The obstacles, the dice, the wooden horses. The name Derby Day, though, faded from the toy shelves after that and disappeared for a long time. And then in 1994, Ravensburger came out with a Derby Days with a S on it, children's game. And the Imagination Company came out with a DVD game in 2005, which was called Derby Day. They revised the artwork in 2006 to make it a little bit more appealing to an adult audience, I guess. Today, the Brybelly Company in the UK is producing a Derby Day game. Appears to be a commercialized version of a traditional pub game, and you can find versions of this all over Etsy and other wood game companies that make a horse race game. So now let's talk about another game in 1931 was produced by Parker Brothers called They're Off. The game began as a simple spin and move horse race game for 2 to 6 players, but in later versions the spinner was replaced with dice. There were 6 colored lanes around the track that the horses follow, and the early version had painted metal horses, but later versions had plastic molded horses. In 1940, another version of They're Off was produced by Pepys. This was a brand name used by Castell Brothers of London. They'd been printing mostly greeting cards and stationery since 1878, but in 1937, they landed a license from Disney's Snow White movie and jumped into the game business using the Pepys name. This game is a set collection card game that includes some hazards and bonuses. Apparently didn't last much beyond the 1940s. It was a lot like Milbourne's type of game. In 1940, the Dumont Television Network produced a television game show called They're Off. They'd play films of famous horse races and then ask trivia questions of the panel. It was a very popular game show. It lasted 5 weeks. The game They're Off was published for quite a few years thereafter. The most recent I could find was this one published in Canada in 1962. In the early 1970s, a game was produced called And They're Off. They added a little and at the beginning. This game was primarily a betting game, and the movement of the horses in the track was driven by cards randomly pulled from a deck. This game was produced by the Really Useful Game Company. It was owned by the composer Andrew Lloyd Webber. He's also listed as one of the designers of this game. In 1975, a game called They're Off was published by the Daily Mirror, a tabloid newspaper in London, England. This, too, was a betting game, but the gimmick was a set of phonograph records with multiple grooves on each record. This would facilitate a certain amount of randomness, unpredictability, to which the horse race recording would play back each time. Which horses would place. You never knew until you dropped the needle on the record which groove of the record was playing back. I actually have a record in my collection that's called Matching Tie and Handkerchief. It was a production by the Monty Python guys. And I was pretty freaked out when I played the record for a friend, and it was not the record that I thought I was listening to. Turns out it has 2 grooves on one side, and I had no idea. Oddly, in 1976, another version was produced called At the Post. So it seems that the horses were not off yet. They're not off, they're still at the post. But it had the records inside, and it was produced by a company called Ronco. Now, you might remember Ronco. They're the famous company that produced the Pocket Fisherman and the Vegematic and Infomercial. Yes, that Ronco. This was their UK company, and they produced compilation records, a lot like K-Tel did. And the Ronco Greatest Hits records are collector's items now, of course, too. So there have been hundreds of horse race games. These are just a few of them, and they come and go, of course, over the years. That included such gems as the oddly named French game called Turf Coot. I found pictures of a couple different versions, which were apparently published in the 1930s, as far as I could tell. A coot is a water bird and slang for an eccentric person. What that has to do with horse racing, I have no idea. The Lucky Race, published in 1919, has a nice horseshoe shape to the track. Several other race games are configured like this. The Race Go Company of Philadelphia produced this clothboard race game, played just like a real horse race, or so it says. And of course there are board games that feature horses that are not about horse racing. I probably have left out your favorite. The horse racing hotness these days is a game called Ready, Set, Bet from AEG. And they've already released a few variations on it, one that's a dice game. It's fun. I like it a lot. It's got a very exciting pace to it. So if you're into horses in any way, I'm sure you can find a board game that has something to do with that theme. But if you don't, that's okay too. Just be sure to play every day. It's not literally a board game, but I find this kind of thing really fascinating. These mechanical toys, mechanical horse race, arcade-style machines from the early part of the century. Jocks of London produced this mechanical horse racing game in the 1890s called Ascot. They offered several sizes, as you can see in this advertisement. Wind up the gadget, and apparently it randomized the winning horse somehow. Not a board game, but a curiosity.